Hello, welcome to this month's webcast. I'm Emily Rhodes, and today I'm going to be talking to you about this book, Charlotte by David Foenkinos, translated by Sam Taylor. It's a really extraordinary book. It's a really hard one to press upon you how much I would love you to read it, because it's incredibly sad. And I think it's so easy to recommend a very joyful, easy, funny book that you know that the recipient is going to make them laugh, it's going to cheer them up, it's going to put them in a really good place. And believe me, I love recommending that kind of book. But I do think it's really important to have a time in your reading life when you decide to maybe step away from the laughs and focus on the sadness and the poignant and the more difficult things to read. I have to say, perhaps this isn't that time for you. And, if you are going through a really tough time in your life, please don't make it worse by reading a really sad book. But I think if you can find the time to sort of take a breath and confront something quite devastating and beautiful, then this is a really good book for you now. So it's called Charlotte. It's about the artist Charlotte Salomon. So I always pronounce her surname wrong because there was a girl at school with me with a very similar surname. Charlotte Salomon, who is a German Jewish artist. She was born just before the Nazis came to power in the Second World War, and from the beginning, and it tells you on this first page, and sort of about the author, about the translator, and about the subject. It tells you straight away that she died in Auschwitz in 1943, gassed along with her unborn child shortly after her arrival. So there's no happy ending, and it's a book that is very much about death, in that we know Charlotte's going to die. This is in the context of Auschwitz and the Holocaust and all those deaths, and to make it even more macabre, I suppose, there's the beginning. David Foenkinos explains how Charlotte was born into a family of suicides. So many of her I've now slightly lost track of quite how many killed themselves, but basically her entire extended family ended up killing themselves at one stage or another, including her own mother. And he even says she learned how to read her own name on a gravestone, which was that of her aunt, her mother's sister, who was also called Charlotte. So there's so much death in this book. But I think what makes this book so extraordinary is that although it's set up to be a book about death, in fact, it is a book about life and a book about learning to live and how we can live, especially when we're forced to be so resourceful, when so much death and difficulty is pressing in on all sides. So I think there's just that is one of the really extraordinary kind of creative tensions in this book, that there's sort of death pressing in, and then there's this figure of Charlotte in the middle, and she's this sort of force of life pushing back out, and so much comes from that tension. So I think on our walk this coming Sunday and on our Zoom, we'll talk a little bit about some of the ways that Charlotte tries to live and how she does that, ranging from the kind of belief when her mother kills herself, she tells Charlotte that she's gone to live with the angels and she'll send her a letter from heaven. And Charlotte, the little child, it's heartbreaking. She's waiting and waiting for the letter. So, she's living in that belief of a kind of different reality, really. There's love, and she has this really intense love affair with a man called Alfred, a singing teacher. There's also this idea of kind of disappearing making herself very, very small, almost invisible, as, you know, she can do less and less during the 30s as the Nazis come to power in Berlin. And I suppose the extension of that is looking at exile as a way of living. And I suppose I was asking the question, you know, what's the difference between living and surviving? And I think the way David Foenkinos, through Charlotte, interrogates the idea of exile is really fascinating. He talks about exile being, you know, in language as well as from a place. And I think we need to also ask the question from that, you know, how bad do things need to be before someone leaves their home? It's so awful reading books about the Holocaust, about all the Jews who thought it would be okay to stay in Germany, and of course it wasn't. And, you know, I say that from a very personal experience of my grandmother actually came over from Germany when she was a child, but her father and mother stayed behind, and her mother followed her. And her father, you know, thought it would be okay. He thought they'd always need accountants. And of course he was killed. So, you know, how bad does it have to be before you decide actually it's better to not live at home? And we look at that in Charlotte's father in particular in the book. And then you think about the things you lose when you leave. And I think you also have to, this book kind of makes you think, and I think any book about the Holocaust makes you think, can you, when you're in that situation, can you ever really imagine quite how bad things are going to be? I suppose going back to this idea of belief that Charlotte had about her mother, you know, do we always believe that it's going to be okay somehow? You know, there's going to be a happy ending. And I think it comes back again and again in this book and many others when, you know, the Jewish people are being lined up or when they're being sent on the trains. There's always a thought that, oh, it is going to be okay. And I think this book is very good at showing how the Germans encouraged that belief to try and keep order. So it's quite a heavy list. I think there's also what makes this book so special is that, of course, Charlotte found her way of living in her work as an artist, in her painting. And we get a kind of glimpse of this early on when she gets accepted against all the odds into the big art school in Berlin, you know, when she couldn't. They weren't really supposed to take any Jewish people in. And then towards the end, in the 40s, where by this time she has left Berlin, she's gone to the south of France, she's taking shelter there with this extraordinary American woman, Ottilie Moore, and the doctor, you know, sees how depressed she is and says, you know, you have to paint, Charlotte. You know, he can see that she's a sort of genius, but has no expression of that. And she sits down and creates her life's work, which is called Life or Theatre. I actually printed off a couple of pictures. I've got them here somewhere. Sorry, the printer actually ran out of ink in the middle of printing them out, so I've only got a couple, but I'll hold them out so you get an idea of the kind of colour and life of them and sort of how extraordinary they are. So her whole work, Life or Theatre, I'll put those away, it's kind of the story of her life, but by, you know, in a way it's kind of autofiction, and they're characters, but she, you know, it's part truth, part fiction, and she kind of sets it to music, and it sounds like an absolutely amazing piece of work that I would love to go and see. So I'm going to keep an eye out for when it's next exhibited. It was exhibited in London at the Jewish Museum a few years ago, and unfortunately I couldn't quite get to it. So I think there's an echo really in this work that she makes, life or theatre, and in this book that David Foenkinos has made, Charlotte, in that they're not quite true and they're not quite fiction. And again, there's a tension there between, maybe your expectations of reading something that's so closely based on a true story. You quite want to be sure of the facts. You want to be certain that nothing's been made up. And that kind of goes against the freedom, really, that comes of writing a work of fiction, the poetic license, the idea of being able to imagine yourself into, talking now about David Foenkinos' book, he can't possibly know absolutely everything in this book. At some points, and in fact, that's a question I want to ask him, what did it feel like to imagine himself into those situations and taking those leaps as a writer of what might have been said, what might have been meant, what Charlotte might have thought, how hard it is to kind of reconstruct all that, and whether it's slightly more freeing doing that in a novel rather than in a biography, a straight biography. Which I suppose kind of brings me to one of the most important bits, I feel, of this book. I'll just read it out. So there's an epilogue of this book. Okay, so sorry, there are a few other things to say first. I'm just going to show you how the book's written. It looks like kind of incredibly long poem. Each sentence has got its own line, and it's very strange reading it like that. I think you're constantly kind of taking a breath and feeling the weight of each sentence. So it's quite a thin book, and it's especially thin if you think there's only one sentence per line. But in the same way that a poem has, each word maybe counts for more in a poem than it does in a novel because there's so few of them. I think the effect of having these, sentence per line is to give each sentence more weight, is to give Charlotte's very, very short life more weight, more gravitas, I suppose, more importance. So there's a lot for us to talk about. I think another brilliant, sort of interesting thing that David does is he writes himself into the story. So Charlotte's story is told in the present tense, and every now and then you get a moment where it slips into the past tense, strangely, where David Foenkinos is writing in the first person, saying, I was here, I walked into her school, this is what I saw, this is how it felt. And then you slip back into the present tense of Charlotte. So he kind of inverts time there. And I'd be interested to know if you've read this, if you found it too much of a jolt, if it kind of lurches you out of Charlotte's story and into the present tense, or if it kind of hints at the way that time isn't necessarily linear. I think there are a lot of things in this book that that shows how time, shows what can collapse time, emotions and feelings and places where time almost hasn't happened, it stood still. So I think time is another big thing we're going to discuss. But just before we run out of time, in the epilogue here, we're talking about Charlotte's work, which is now being seen by her parents. And there's just a tiny paragraph here where it says, so her stepmother she doesn't totally believe everything in Charlotte's work, life or theatre. He says, that is the whole beauty of Charlotte's project. What is life? What is theatre? Who can know the truth? And I think that captures so much about this book. What is the truth? Who can know it? Are there different truths? Anyway, there's masses to talk about here. So this is our February book, Charlotte, by David Foenkinos. I'm really looking forward to discussing it with you.